Welcome to The Appetite, a podcast brought to you by Opal Food and Body Wisdom. We are a podcast all about all things food, body, movement, and mental health. And today, I am your host, Julie Church, registered dietitian, one of the co-founders of Opal, and director of people and culture, as well as nutrition director. And I am joined by Aleta Storch, dietitian and owner of Wise Heart Nutrition, and more affectionately, broadly known, I think, as the ADHD dietitian. Aleta, I'm glad to have you here.
I'm super excited to be here too, Julie.
Yeah. So we are on screen looking at each other, but recording here in a studio. And Aleta and I haven't seen each other in person for a while, but our paths crossed when Aleta began working at Opal years ago in a milieu therapy role as well as a primary therapy role, as well as helping us in the pandemic to launch a virtual IOP. I forgot about that. That was a big project that Aleta helped us with. But today, I am excited to be able to have you as listeners hear Aleta's just wisdom and where she's grown to be really specialized in helping individuals that struggle with food and body concerns and also identify with neurodivergence and especially ADHD. So, Aleta, what else did I miss that you would want our listeners to know about you?
I think you hit all the big points, dietitian and therapist. So kind of, the two, nutrition and mental health overlap.
Yes, you have that dual degree, which is a lovely kind of unique thing that you bring, especially to, I'm sure, in this conversation today. Thank you. Yeah, good reminder. So where do we want to start? I want to hear and let our listeners into how you got into this specialty and where that kind of interest and passion came from. So give us a little backdrop into where you came from, other than your little bits of time at Opal.
Well, yeah, that sounds like a great place to start. So I guess kind of rewinding, as a little kid, I always really struggled with food. And it was mostly like forgetting to eat or forgetting my lunch, being a really picky eater. And so there were a lot of issues that kind of presented like almost like ARFID, right? Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. But it wasn't ever diagnosed. And then the term ADHD was kind of thrown around, but my parents were sort of like, she'll get over it, it'll be fine. But they were always really worried about my eating because they wanted to make sure that I was eating enough. I also grew up like with intuitive eating, kind of the norm in my household. I feel really lucky for that. So I wasn't really exposed a lot to diet culture. But then when I went to college, diet culture was sort of everywhere. And essentially, like, to be in community with other people, to fit in, to be accepted, it kind of felt like I had to engage in that and be part of that. And I was already kind of coming into college undernourished because I didn't have my parents, right, like constantly being like, did you eat? Here's some food. Make sure you get whatever's in the refrigerator. So then it just sort of snowballed and essentially turned into an eating disorder. And I was able to get treatment for that in outpatient and help to resize intuitive eating, which was really great. Fast forward to grad school, I had done like so much of the healing around the diet culture piece, letting go of the food rules, body image, but I was still really struggling with food. So it's kind of in this restrict binge cycle, but it didn't feel the same. It didn't feel like I was intentionally restricting. And so that was when it kind of came to light that it was maybe more related to the logistics piece. So I went ahead and I got assessed for ADHD, got diagnosed, and those two pieces just kind of came together. And I was able to just like better understand my brain a little bit and understand what was getting in the way of feeding myself and develop some like tools and systems. And I never would have been able to do that if I hadn't kind of come to it through the lens of neurodivergence or through the lens of ADHD. Because for a long time, I thought it was just me, like a personal failing, right?
Totally.
So then fast forward even longer, I graduated grad school and you all hired me as a milieu therapist, which is where I learned so much about eating disorders. I mean, that is the foundation of the work that I do now. And I noticed a lot of clients who kind of struggled with similar things that I had struggled with in grad school, where maybe like diet culture was present, but it wasn't like the underlying motivation for restriction, and just sort of seeing them struggle more on the weekends when food wasn't served to them, right? And just kind of like, again, struggling more with those logistics.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to notice that in my own clients in Wise Heart Nutrition, and just kind of started to make the connections that there is a lot of overlap between eating disorders and neurodivergence, and it was not being talked about at all. I tried doing lots of research and found nothing. I was like, okay, I'm going to create this model, and it seemed to really resonate with my clients, and from there it has just grown.
Yeah.
And that's
That's
how I kind of came to be
love it.
focused on ADHD.
Thank
Yeah.
you. That's so helpful. I'm sure our listeners love hearing that personal part, right? So much of, yeah, that just inspires and helps people see the context in which you can be such a great helper and understand it. And I love that you said when you had that diagnosis of the ADHD, it did help you to grow in understanding your brain and how it worked. And I do hope that that's kind of what comes out of this too, is just a bigger picture recognition that neurodivergence, a lot of this conversation today is just like understanding that different brains work differently, and then therefore, what does that look like for people that struggle with food and body issues? If you could back up, just wanting to make sure our listeners understand what maybe acronyms are being used. The ADHD, you've said a few times, so if you could state what that is and maybe give a quick little spiel on that, that would be helpful to make sure people understood what you were sharing about your story.
Yeah, absolutely. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it used to be called ADHD or ADD, but now they're just using ADHD. And it is essentially difficulties with executive functioning, which I'm sure we will talk a lot about moving forward in the episode. And then issues with emotional regulation. So feeling really big emotions, feeling emotionally out of control. And people can present as more like the hyperactive, which I think we kind of associate with like little boys in first grade zooming all over the place. Or they can be more of the inattentive, which can present as more like daydreamy and just sort of like not paying attention and forgetful. Or people can be combined. So those are sort of the three subsets of ADHD.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I guess beyond that, right? So that's one potential diagnosis. That's part of your story and your journey. So we're kind of starting there. But if you could expand for our listeners, what is even neurodivergence then? So if ADHD is one potential diagnosis or experience that people might have that then might have them in that being maybe quote unquote labeled with that or having that terminology, who else? How else? What other symptoms or experiences fit into that?
Yeah. So neurodivergence, like you said, is a big kind of broad umbrella category. So that includes ADHD, but it also includes things like autism, obsessive compulsive disorder, and just like, other forms of what we would call like mental health conditions, where the brain is functioning differently than, I'm going to put it in quotes, like normal brains, right? what we typically see among the broader population. And it's not really like a scientific definition, but it's more of like a terminology for individual folks who like might have differences in the levels of neurotransmitters that are available or the number of receptors that are kind of functioning in the brain. So it's a pretty big category, but it's not necessarily like a clinical term. If that makes sense.
Great.
Yeah.
That is helpful to say. It's maybe not scientific in that way, but it kind of holds some of these mental health conditions or diagnoses that have emerged over the years. So what is the current science saying in terms of cause, or is this just genetic, or what leads somebody to potentially be given some of those kinds of diagnoses? I know that probably could be a whole different podcast, but can you give us a little nugget?
Yes. Yeah. And I don't think it's like fully understood kind of where that's coming from, but we do know that it can be a mix of genetics and it can be environmental. So folks who experience trauma are more likely to have some of these diagnoses later in life. Something like the pandemic, right, can kind of cause some of these experiences. The thing we do know, like biologically, is that there is like some kind of difference in neurotransmitters, the way that those things are moving through the brain, the receptors that are associated with those neurotransmitters. And it's very, very genetic. So if a parent has ADHD, kid is very likely to have ADHD. So we kind of see that passed down Yeah, through
Okay,
family.
helpful. Thank you. Okay, so what else, I guess, in some of this terminology, what other words or phrases would you want to clarify for our listeners before we get into the specificity around this and eating disorders?
Great question. So a lot of people use neurodivergence and the terms neurodiverse and neurodiversity interchangeably, but they are actually have very different meanings. So neurodivergence is really referring, neurodivergence or divergent is referring to an individual. So someone whose brain actually functions differently. Neurodiverse is more like within a group. So it's designating differences among a group. So you could have a group of neurotypical folks, and that group is not neurodiverse. And then neurodiversity is kind of like in general among the population, we have differences in brains. So we just sort of live in a world with neurodiversity.
Great.
Yeah, hopefully that helps.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let me know if I misuse one of those three because it's very similar, but I can
Easy
hear
to
it.
do so.
I hear it.
Yeah.
I hear the difference. So let's see if I can learn from you even in the moment and see if I have that. All right. So we've talked about these other mental health conditions that individuals might then have neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, OCD, and other mental health concerns. What about eating disorders and what's the intersection or crossover of eating disorders with this?
Yeah. So there is a major crossover. I actually pulled some actual stats for that. So the prevalence of eating disorders that we know of in the United States, so these are people who have been diagnosed, that is about 2 to 3%. And 30% of those people also have ADHD. So again, these are people who have been diagnosed with an eating disorder and properly diagnosed with ADHD. And 30% is a pretty big number. And then in a 2011 Harvard study, females or female presenting folks with ADHD were 4 times as likely to have an eating disorder than those who did not have ADHD.
Wow.
So yeah,
Those are big
a lot
numbers.
higher prevalence. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I don't have the stats on the crossover of individuals, the comorbidity of obsessive compulsive disorder and eating disorders, but I also know that is quite high. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. And it really makes sense. You kind of think about the pathway of getting there can fall into like 2 different groups. So the eating disorder can actually function as a way of making up for important human needs that aren't being met, or like maybe don't feel like they're being met for someone with ADHD. So some of those could be like a sense of control or feelings of adequacy and competence and accomplishment. Those are all things that can be difficult to experience when someone has ADHD and is trying to exist in a world that is built for a neurotypical brain. So that's sort of the first pathway. And then
And so then you're saying like,
ahead.
sorry if that's okay. So then you're saying, yeah, somebody is not feeling like they have a sense of control or don't feel a sense of accomplishment, or some of those natural human needs aren't being met. Therefore, an eating disorder develops for them to try to mask that or function in that way to have a sense of control by controlling food or having a sense of I have accomplished this one thing instead of other avenues of life. Thank you. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's like so normal, right? To turn to food because it's everywhere and it's an easy thing to do. And we're told we should be able to control that. And so I think it's an easy place for folks with ADHD to end up. And the sort of second pathway, and both of these can exist for someone, is that the disordered patterns are more of a result of the symptoms of ADHD. So something like emotional dysregulation can lead to emotional soothing through food because that causes a dopamine release, right? And folks with ADHD have low dopamine. It can also be like all or nothing thinking or perfectionism, inattention and forgetting to eat, sensory processing issues. So there's like texture dislikes, flavor dislikes, that sort of thing. So those are kind of the two ways that I've seen eating disorders kind of show up for ADHDers.
To expand on that, maybe is there any other, like maybe a specific playing out or like a scenario, like let's talk breakfast or let's talk busy work schedule. And then what happens?
Yeah. So if someone maybe like doesn't have a lot of structure or routine, right? Which happened in the pandemic. People were home. We didn't know what to do with ourselves. And without those kind of like built-in or inherent reminders to eat, or maybe being able to like get food at work, it can become really easy to just sort of like forget, not tune into our bodies. So then we're not eating all day. And then all of a sudden at the end of the day, there's like this extreme hunger that can kind of turn into more of like binge eating or more compensatory eating, right? Like our bodies actually need that food.
Mm-hmm.
So that binge restrict cycle shows up a lot for ADHDers. Another would be maybe someone who's like a really picky eater, and there's like not a lot of foods available that they're excited about or that they want to eat. And so again, there can be more of that restriction that then turns into binge eating with foods that they are willing to eat. And in the research, and I would say like in dominant culture, when ADHD is talked about in terms of eating disorders, the focus is really on binge eating. And there's sort of this belief that like ADHDers binge eat because we have no impulse control and we're seeking dopamine. And that's true, right? Like that exists. But typically it's because the restriction is there, the underlying restriction. And I think that gets ignored, that it's actually not a binging quote problem, right? It's more of an unintentional restriction problem that is seen with a lot of the different symptoms.
Okay. And would you say what about sort of the aspect of body image or appearance or, yeah, where does that play in more or less for this population that might end up finding themselves struggling with an eating disorder, but the root being some of these neurodivergence? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say there are more cases of something like ARFID where the body image piece isn't as prevalent. And right, we're all existing in diet culture. So a lot of ADHDers have been exposed to that, and a lot of ADHDers are pursuing thinness because that's what society tells us is important. So there is a lot of crossover with that. I think the difficulty for folks doing that healing work can come from some of that like all or nothing thinking. So that mindset of like, I either like look this way or it's not good enough, or I need to like feel good about my body in order to take care of it. And the emotional dysregulation, right? When we're feeling uncomfortable in our bodies, it can feel so overwhelming that then there's just sort of this avoidance or this shutdown. So I do see a lot of avoidance of being in the body with ADHDers because it is just like this visceral overwhelm.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that because as you share, you're using the language of the intuitive eating or listening to the body or connecting to the body. And I would love to know the unique considerations of where that plays in the struggle and then where it plays into like the healing, right? Kind of where does interoceptive awareness and intuitiveness and attunement, where does it fit in?
Yeah, with my clients and folks in my membership, we talk a lot about what you called interoceptive awareness, right? So the understanding of kind of what's going on inside of our bodies. And a lot of folks with ADHD and just like folks who are neurodivergent, that interoceptive awareness isn't really fine-tuned. So it's really easy to tune out or ignore body cues. So that can be with eating, but it can also be like needing to go pee and just putting it off and not noticing until it's like, oh my gosh, it's an emergency. I need to go deal with this. So the same sort of thing happens with food where there isn't an awareness because we're paying attention to so many other things and the stimulus in our environment is kind of taking over. So then we're not tuned into our internal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that creates that restrict binge cycle. Because if we're not stopping and noticing, oh, I'm hungry, then we're not going to eat. And similar with fullness, it's easy to just like eat and not pay attention. And then all of a sudden be like, whoa, I am really, really, really full and uncomfortable. Yeah. And so we do a lot of work around kind of developing that skill of tuning into the body. And with something like intuitive eating, it's really built for neurotypical folks, right? Because it's like, well, just notice, just pay attention, and the hunger will come.
Yeah.
A lot of folks with ADHD are on stimulant medication. So that adds another layer where like you can listen all day long, but you're not going to feel hunger in that maybe like traditional body way. And so it can be really helpful for folks to learn like what are some other, maybe not cues, but like indications that you need food.
Okay.
And typically that's like a worsening of ADHD symptoms. So like poor focus and concentration, just like feeling really distracted, feeling really tired, that sort of stuff.
Okay. So feeling tired, I guess, would be a physical sensation, but
Mm-hmm.
what you just shared was a little bit more like thoughts or experiences. Would you say, though, that there is like an eventual ability to connect to the body and listen and notice those cues for these individuals? Or would you say that it's more like needing to find a long-term solution because they're not going to be connected to those physical cues?
Yeah, I would say both. I think for some people it's easier to maybe like build that awareness, and probably easier for folks who are not taking a stimulant medication because they don't have that additional barrier. I think for some people they will be able to notice those more like physical sensations, but they might need an external cue as a reminder to check in. And I think that's
Absolutely.
the piece where like a long-term solution can be really helpful.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good clarification. Can you speak in terms of the stimulant medication? My understanding is some people might be on that all the like daily, and others might just use it PRN. Like, okay, I need to study for this test. I'm going to need focus for this project at work. I'm going to take this. Can you speak a little bit to that in terms of the population, and then how much of it is how long? Maybe what's the word? Not shelf life, but the
So like half-life
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah. So, what is
yeah.
the half-life of these kinds of stimulant medications for somebody that might be on it all the time versus the person that's just using it PRN?
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, like disclaimer, I'm not a prescriber, not a pharmacist, not a medication expert.
I'm not asking you to be,
But
but
right,
what's your
yeah, yeah.
yes?
Just a disclaimer. But with the Adderall extended release is an example. So with an extended release stimulant, that's going to last more like 8 to 10 hours, kind of depending on the individual body and metabolism, that sort of thing. So that's where people kind of have the like not eat all day, and then 6 o'clock hits. And then they're starving because the medication has
Worn
worn off.
off.
And so then they're like, oh, there's the hunger cues. And then there's immediate release, which lasts about like 3 to 4 hours. And oftentimes that's prescribed more to kids, and I'm not entirely sure why. But being on an immediate release can be really helpful in kind of creating those like natural waves of, okay, like I'm not hungry because I ate. And then by the time it wears off, oh, okay, I'm hungry. And then you take another medication after you eat. So I've found for a lot of clients, talking to their prescribers and actually switching to immediate release can be really helpful at the beginning stages of healing with food and eating. Just, yeah, because it's like one less barrier to work with.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great.
Did that answer your question?
No, yeah, that was great. Just a
Okay.
little bit more
Okay.
in that. I think it's one of those things that many people that are prescribed medications for mental health conditions and for other things to kind of go, it's kind of a side effect. And I think,
Mhm.
yes, in the realm of concerns around eating disorder or recovery, I know it's always this question of like, ooh, should somebody be on a stimulant if, it kind of brings me back to this thing I think about with chicken and the egg conversation of going, well, what came first in some ways, and maybe it's neither here nor there, but I do think that often, even with any other like depression or anxiety and the comorbidity with eating disorders, it's like some people will struggle with those first and then the eating disorder develops. And some people might develop an eating disorder and then they develop depression and anxiety. And I hear this similarly in this way sometimes of going, oh, somebody could kind of the chicken and the egg of like which one is the eating disorder could have come out of having their own experience with ADHD or OCD. Or I wonder of the flip side, and I don't know, maybe you could speak to that, of like somebody that might develop an eating disorder, but then maybe not the diagnosis doesn't come until after they're diagnosed with the eating disorder, then they get diagnosed with ADHD or OCD as kind of going, oh, maybe that was pre-existing. So just that
Yeah.
chicken the egg conversation.
Yeah, such an important thing to talk about. And it is like so crucial to kind of differentiate those two. because an eating disorder can often present as ADHD, right? Like if we're not feeding ourselves, if we're not nourished, our executive function, so it's going to be organization and planning and attention and emotional regulation, all of those are impacted pretty negatively. So someone who is undernourished for long enough is actually going to present as if they have ADHD. So I think it's like totally safe to diagnose that, but a full assessment, right, of when did this actually start? Is this something that you've experienced your entire life? And now that maybe you're in treatment, you have access to that possibility of diagnosis. But if it's maybe like symptoms that haven't been lifelong, that would point to, okay, maybe this is the eating disorder that then kind of led to these symptoms. And yeah, I mean, that's a big assessment and not everyone has access to that, but maybe even just thinking for themselves, right? Has this always been something I've experienced?
As you mentioned, sort of the diagnosis process, I'm curious if you could speak to that. What does an assessment look like for ADHD, and where would somebody do that?
Yeah, the assessment is a very thorough, time-consuming process. So not a lot of people, right, have access to that or even have like time to go through that process. But it's essentially looking across your entire lifespan and across different areas of your life. So like within your family, within school and work and relationships, are these different executive function issues showing up? And if they like have been around since someone was like a little kid, that is going to be a better indication of having ADHD again versus like, oh, this just started when I began working at Google, which right, like it's a really overwhelming place to work. So it's a bunch of different tests. They're like computer tests that kind of, I guess, like assess like brain function, organization, planning, that sort of stuff. I got mine, I guess, like 12 years ago, and I don't totally remember all the ins and outs, but I remember it being a big thing.
Yeah,
And
and
being really happy
okay.
when it was done.
Well, and I think what you're saying, yeah, it's an assessment. It's maybe interactive or question answering. There's no blood test.
Nope.
It's not something that somebody can just take to see, oh, this shows up in your genes somehow, right? So I think it's just good to say that if somebody doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And that would be done through a psychologist
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists, psychologists. There are some like ARNPs who can do a full assessment. But I do think, again, like if it's accessible, I do think that's really, really important because of the potential for misdiagnosis. Because ADHD can look like so many other things. It can look like borderline personality can kind of look like ADHD. If someone has experienced a lot of trauma and has PTSD, that can look like ADHD. And so being able to like rule out or diagnose those things and also recognizing it could be a mix of those things, right? So someone can get the proper treatment. And then the other thing that I've noticed a lot of recently is kind of this misdiagnosis when someone is just trying to exist like in hustle culture. So trying to exist in a world where there's really high expectations. There is a lot of perfectionism. We're constantly experiencing like a bombardment of notifications, right? And technology and stimuli. And so I think it's important to ask, like, is this ADHD? Or is it just what happens when we try and exist in this like overwhelming environment? And so I think, yeah, that's something like in the next couple of years, I think there will be more information around. That's just something to kind of pay attention to.
Okay. And what I love about what you just said is that really every listener those that maybe have this diagnosis or don't could be subject to some of the ways that their brain might be wired or their life might be kind of oriented to even be leading to some of these difficulties of emotion regulation or executive functioning. And so I love that because it does make even what I want us to move into a little bit next, which is some of these practical things, maybe helpful for who cares if somebody has been diagnosed or not, but maybe they are finding, wow, like I'm forgetting to pack my lunch. Now what? Wait, help me, So I would, it sounds like getting into those specifics and giving people some tools really has been helpful for folks. And so I'm curious if you could share more around some of those stories of hope and healing and some examples that really helped people move through not feeling held back by some of the ways that their brain works, because I think we all would love to find ways to continue to live more freely. So
I'm so glad that you named that piece, right? That just because someone doesn't have a diagnosis doesn't mean that they're not experiencing maybe like even like symptoms or characteristics of neurodivergence. And so a lot of these things can be helpful for people kind of across the board, or like in times of stress or overwhelm, or when there's like a global trauma, right? That these aren't just for folks with ADHD or autism, and like a clinical diagnosis isn't accessible to everyone.
yeah.
So with clients, with group members, the big thing that we really focus on to start with is that kind of awareness piece. So really understanding our brains, right? Like, why are our brains different? How is this impacting our life? How is it impacting our relationship with food, with eating, with body? And creating a little bit of self-compassion around that, self-compassion and acceptance, right? Because we can't undo neurodivergence. And the goal is not to make someone neurotypical. And so, creating space to like say like this sucks sometimes, right? This makes life really hard sometimes. And like, this is where I'm at and it can be okay. And then really working on establishing like meeting basic food needs. So really focusing on like, how do we get enough? How do we eat regularly? How do we get variety? And then once that's established, focusing more on like pleasure and satisfaction and gentle nutrition. And then, just accessing like proper care and support communities. I found that a lot of neurodivergent folks really thrive when they're in community and when they're around people who share similar experiences. So we do a lot of work like trying to help find these communities and these support networks for folks.
Great. So those kind of three categories I'm hearing, like awareness, increasing awareness and self-compassion. The second one being helping them meet their basic food needs. And the third being community and connection, kind of not feeling alone or isolated in it. And I feel like we talked a little bit about the awareness piece earlier, but I am curious about the meeting basic food needs category. What are some of your favorite tools to help people in that? What gets you, I don't know, most excited?
And that's, you're nailing it there, right? That's the logistics category. That's like where we can create skills and tools and systems, and where there's like a lot of fun for creativity as well. So I guess like a really good example would be folks really struggling with planning for meals throughout the week. So oftentimes people say like, oh, like I had this idea to make these 3 recipes this week. And then like I bought all the ingredients and then it just all rotted in my fridge because I didn't want to make any of them. So what we really talk about is, are you planning for variation and differences in your energy and your capacity and your motivation throughout the week? Because we know that sometimes those are going to be major barriers. And if you've planned this extravagant meal that you've never made before, right, it's not going to happen. You're not going to make it. So you're kind of setting yourself up for what feels like failure. So I like to talk about something called level planning. So I basically just created this system where it's level 1 through 5. And you essentially think of like, what are meals that I can make or have when I have essentially no motivation? I'm exhausted, right? I don't have any capacity, no spoons left at the end of the day. And identifying like 5 or 6 meals that kind of fall into that level. And then kind of working up the scale to level 5. And maybe that extravagant meal is level 5. And then thinking about, what does your week look like, right? Like, if you're working every day and you have like a big project due and you have plans with friends on Wednesday night, right? Like, planning for level 5 meals throughout the week is not going to be helpful. So we really identify like, when do you need a level 1 or a 2? And I think that can take a lot of the pressure off of folks who feel like, well, if I'm not planning for these big complicated meals when I'm not doing it right. And yeah, so doing a lot of that, doing a lot of outsourcing. How do we make the level 3 a level 2? Maybe you buy pre-cut vegetables, right? And so there's a lot of room to work within that. And that's probably one of my favorite tools for
Cool.
working with clients.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's awesome. And I think the seeing somebody be able to still, yeah, feed themselves, meet their basic needs in the midst of that. I also think the integration, knowing your philosophy around food and nutrition, being from that non-diet, anti-diet approach, you're working with people that, yes, if you're using more convenience foods or already prepared foods, processed foods, it's acceptable and you are good and you are loved. And that's okay. And I think that too, just probably having to be a voice into lots of people's experience that's so influenced by diet culture about saying one thing or another in regards to food being good or bad. So
yeah, there is so much shame and stigma around that, right? Like, well, if I'm not cooking and I'm
right.
just heating up frozen meals, then I'm not like quote healthy. And I like to talk to clients about kind of this like big picture of health, almost like a pie, right? Like physiological, biological health is just like one slice of that pie. But then what about like emotional and relational and mental and financial, right? Can eating maybe more of these processed foods support those other areas of health?
Yeah.
And is that maybe then supportive of the whole? And again, I think that can be relieving for people that there's so much focus on this like physical, biological health and not tending to those other parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it just identifies the diversity of the different kinds of eaters we all are too. And so,
Yes.
and you mentioned creativity about this kind of trying to meet basic needs. All of us, I think there's an element of creativity that has to come into our meal planning and food and eating. And
Mm-hmm.
some people like more novelty and want there to be a bit more of a creative expression or artfulness that goes into that aspect of their life. And others, it's just more function. And they, it's not a part of any other, big hit of kind of who they are or what they want in terms of joy in their day. It's a lot more function. And so I think it's really, I'm sure, like that helping everybody just kind of discover the eater they are and then living into that versus trying to live up to any type of standards.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like everyone's an individual and unique, and we all get to, yeah, be whatever kind of eater we need to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. I would love, maybe, Evan, as we're sort of wrapping up our conversation, the community aspect was that third part of what you said really is important. And I would love for you've mentioned it a couple times, talking about a membership or your members. And so I know that you've created community for your clients and members, and would just love to hear what you have to offer there, as well as other ideas and resources out there and things that Aleta will share. We can have in our list there on the show description so that you can get quickly to those listeners and find out about these resources. But I'd love to hear what you're offering and others that you know in the community.
Yeah, and it's exciting to say that there are so many more resources that align with, right, like health at every size, anti-diet, intuitive eating for folks who are neurodivergent now compared to 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, it was like, well, I don't know. There's literally nothing out there. So I developed essentially like a model, like an eating with ADHD model. And over the last several years, that has kind of grown into this group membership. So it's a monthly membership. People pay a monthly fee. We try and keep it really, really affordable to increase access. So anywhere in the world, anyone in the world can join. And it's workshops and it's a private community and it's coaching with myself and the other dietitian who works for me, Sarah, and body doubling sessions. So people can show up and like do their dishes every other week. So it's a bunch of resources, but it's also community and connection. And yeah, we have guest experts who focus on different like ADHD skills, and then we do workshops on things that are related to like intuitive eating, that sort of stuff. So that's like a paid community. But then we also have a Facebook group, Intuitive Eating with ADHD. That's free. Anyone can join. And there are some incredible conversations going on. There's also a lot of colleagues and providers who are part of the group who identify as having ADHD. So there's just a lot of support. There's a lot of wisdom, a lot of expertise. So that is a really great free resource. There are quite a few eating disorder support groups for folks with ADHD. And if you go to my website and look at the resources page, I have some of those listed, and they range from free to paid. Yeah, those are kind of the best places to start. And on the resource list, I have like book recommendations, podcasts, that sort of stuff as well.
Oh, good. Okay. I was going to say maybe there hasn't been anything published yet, but there's maybe a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. I'll make sure to have all of those linked for folks to access. And what else? I guess I'm curious, listeners may be kind of sitting here going, gosh, I never thought that maybe this was me. And so any encouragement or next steps that you'd give to somebody that is feeling like maybe that's what I need to target versus just sort of the same hamster wheel of addressing their eating disorder from the way they have. Maybe I do want to address it from this angle. What would you recommend for their next steps?
Yeah. So again, if you have resources, if you have access to it, right, getting assessed and connecting with anti-diet and HAES providers, so therapist, dietitian. If you're really struggling with an eating disorder, checking out Opal, right? I think you all do a really good job of acknowledging neurodivergence, and then just kind of like learning more about it in general. So, like I said, like there are books, there are podcasts, there are resources. A lot of them do have a lot of diet culture and fat phobic kind of tones to them. So just like being aware of that, being wary, taking what fits, letting go of what doesn't, and then the community piece. I think those are kind of the best places to start.
Cool. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
There's one thing that's sort of lingering for me, and I wonder if we could have a quick little bit. I feel like ARFID was mentioned. Actually, you mentioned it sort of in the very beginning about your own story, and then maybe one other point. But I don't feel like we've used the broader term of eating disorders, disordered eating. We haven't necessarily said anything about ARFID. And I would wonder if you could share kind of where does that fit into this whole conversation, and fill the listener in on that.
So ARFID, for folks who don't know, it's that avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And so it is a restrictive eating disorder that's typically not associated with like body image concerns, that pursuit of thinness. And it is something that we see a lot of among ADHDers, among folks with OCD, folks who have autism. And a big part of that is that neurodivergent folks can have this like increased sensitivity to stimuli. So different textures, different tastes, different smells, even like the way that things look can feel really overwhelming. And there can be this kind of like hard stop, like, nope, not going to eat that. And that can really lead to what would be called picky eating, right? And that term, again, like there's so much stigma around it. Limited food preferences would maybe be the better way of describing it.
Okay.
Right. And so when you have limited food preferences, it's a lot harder to meet your food needs. But trying to force yourself or force others to eat foods that are like, in terms of like a sensory experience, are really overwhelming, that can be traumatizing and can actually lead to more avoidance. Yeah. So I like to like have clients fill out like a food preferences survey where we kind of look at like, what do you like? What do you want to try? And then really talk about like, how do we meet your needs within these differences, right? And are there maybe foods that you're avoiding because you imagine that it's going to have that texture? And that's where maybe some like gentle exposure work can come in. And I found that clients tend to be pretty open to that when it's more experimentation and gathering information rather than like you have to be able to eat these things in order to, right, like not have an eating disorder. So it's a gentle approach. And again, just kind of like working with those differences.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. And I know that we have seen more and more individuals coming to seek treatment at Opal with that diagnosis and are just continuing to pivot and change our treatment approach too, since the needs are different and the structure that like what we provide still can really help somebody work regularly on those exposures and trying new things, but also discovering kind of just adequate eating again, right? And kind of bring all their other biological systems back online and allowing for them to really stay in their life, get back into their life. So thanks. Yeah. that is helpful for sure. And I see, with so much of our conversation today will likely be ADHD or has been the conversation around ADHD, but I think the overlap with ARFID and autism or ARFID and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is also like a whole nother conversation. So maybe that's another podcast coming.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, like there is so much overlap too, right? Like a lot of the things we talked about definitely apply to those other forms of neurodivergence, and there's a lot of differences.
Well, Aleta, thank you so much for being here, and we'll make sure to have all the ways that our listeners can get in touch with you too. And thank you, listeners, for being here. And thank you also to Jack Straw Cultural Center for our sound engineering, David Bazzi for our editing, and Aaron Davidson for our original music. Until next time, have a good one.